Okay. All right. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Institute of International Studies. My name is Daniel Sargent, and I'm co-director of the Institute. It's my great pleasure to be able to introduce our featured speaker for today. But before I do that, I want to acknowledge a couple of people in the room who've made today's event possible. First and foremost, really, my Goldman School of Public Policy colleague, Dorothy Kronig, who's seated at the back of the room. Dorothy would be doing the introduction, but I'm doing it in her place today. But it's really Dorothy who made the connection to Ambassador Feeley and made today's event possible. We're also very grateful to our executive director, Jess Olney, standing in the back of the room, who played an invaluable part in making today's event happen. I'm just here to do a quick introduction. So let me introduce to you Ambassador John Feeley, an experienced American diplomat and career U.S. foreign servant who served as United States ambassador to Panama from 2015 through to March 2018. A graduate of Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service and a distinguished graduate of the National War College, Feeley began his career as a U.S. Marine Corps helicopter pilot before joining the Department of State in 1990. So if you have any questions about how diplomatic culture and military culture interface, this is the man who can answer those questions. Over nearly 3 decades in the Foreign Service, he developed deep expertise in Western Hemisphere affairs, including during postings in Mexico, Colombia, and the Dominican Republic. In his roles as Deputy Executive Secretary to Secretaries of State Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice, as Director for Central American Affairs, and Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs. As U.S. Ambassador to Panama, Ambassador Feeley was known for his focus on bilateral relations with Panama and broader Latin American issues. And I'll just conclude this introduction by noting that Ambassador Feeley resigned his ambassadorship in 2018, publicly citing a conflict between his professional obligations and the policies of the Trump administration. This is a point on which you might perhaps expound in the context of today's talk. It's wonderful to have you here, Ambassador Feeley. Thanks for joining us in Berkeley.
Thank you so very much, Daniel. I genuinely appreciate it. Thank you. I always think that when you sit at a round table and people are clapping, you're being retired. Thank you very much. Very generous. Thank you, Dorothy. Lovely sort of serendipity. I'm an inveterate East Coast guy from New York. Spent my whole life in Latin America and on the East Coast. I've only gotten out to California on rare occasions, and this is certainly perhaps the most enjoyable one. And also a very special thanks to Madam Secretary Napolitano. It's a real honor and pleasure to see you again after many years of service. So Dorothy and I were talking, and one of the things that I was asked when she kindly invited me out here was a title. And I don't title things normally. I'm a career bureaucrat by nature, and so my bosses title things, and then I just write the talking points for them. So I thought, what am I going to call this thing, talking about Venezuela and Trump foreign policy? And so I thought, all right, I'm an old pilot. I'll call it Who's Flying This Thing? Because the simple fact is, I tend to think in aviation-related metaphors as I kind of bumble my way through life. Given that, things like ground school, knowledge of aircraft systems, flight planning, emergency procedures, and skills built upon repeated practice have always been very important to me, not just in aviation, but in most aspects of my life. You know, there is a saying, there are old pilots and there are bold pilots, but there are no old, bold pilots. And so I have the gray hair to prove that I was not a bold pilot, but I did do it. And in an upfront sort of confession, this is my way of saying that my confirmation bias in this conversation is in favor of technocratic expertise, skills building via mentoring, constant practice, and experience. And these all matter, I think, in any endeavor, but especially in one where you don't ever want to hear the words Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. And I think it's fair to say that in the last year, a lot of our country has been crying Mayday, and we really do need to ask ourselves, who's flying this thing? So the caveat here up front, as Daniel stated, is that I was a career FSO. This is not, and my comments here should not be taken in a partisan vein. Again, I confessed up front what my bias is. My bias is that I kind of believe that the best endeavors, and certainly the endeavors of government, should always be informed by science, by policy, by experience, and by some kind of coherence to, as they say in Spanish, entre dicho y hecho, what is said and what is done. So, with that in mind, let's review the campaign records of our current president with a focus on the militarization of American foreign policy. Now, this is not Donald Trump's fault. The militarization of American foreign policy is an undeniable and unanticipated consequence of 9/11 and the US invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. Most traditional texts teach that a nation state has four main instruments of national power: diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. And those are pretty straightforward. Interestingly, my observation in the last year is that this government has gotten rid of the first two. They've gotten rid of diplomacy as a profession by neutering the State Department, by eviscerating the USAID. They've gotten really rid of informational by shutting down anything that is genuine, like the Voice of America, and replacing that with disinformation. And what does that leave? And I was thinking about it. It leaves M and E, me, which I'm sure Donald Trump would love. But your military and your economic tools of national power projection. But let's not forget that we have all lived through three campaigns. And while running for campaign, Donald Trump spoke repeatedly for the need to stop engaging in endless forever wars. Those are his terms, and he's a very powerful communicator. He said that removing warmongers and America last globalists was among his second-term foreign policy priorities. He makes constant reference to deep staters, diplomats, and what he calls the Davos set. We all know what that is. He's often drawn lines of contrast with Republican primary opponents. Back in 2020, when they were rolling out something called Trump 47, he posted a video online in which he talked of how he was the only president in generations who didn't start a war. In that same video, Trump called himself the only president who rejected the catastrophic advice of many of Washington's generals, bureaucrats, and the so-called diplomats who only know how to get us into conflict, but they don't know how to get us out. And so I'm sure that the 8.5 wars that he's solved are an example of how he gets the world out of conflict. In January 2024, at a New Hampshire rally, he referred to former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley, who was his first-term UN ambassador, as a warmonger whose mentality on foreign policy is, let's kill people all over the place, and let's make a lot of money for those people that make the messes. That's how he attacked Nikki Haley. Candidate Trump was vociferous in his disdain for both the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's called them strategic mistakes, a rare point of coincidence that I share with him. He said, we made a terrible mistake getting involved there in the first place. We spent $2 trillion, thousands of lives, and we don't even have the oil. So, a couple of key points about his campaign rhetoric. The rhetoric reflects deep American isolationism, which he did not start. It's a long tradition. You all know it. 1930s, prior to the Second World War. He decries war profiteering. We can come back to that in the question and answer period, but with specific reference to Venezuela, there is and will be a whole hell of a lot of profiteering. And he's also highly and very viscerally, a lot of times, critical of what he considers to be deep state generals, people like me, senior diplomats, national security, people like Madam Secretary. So this was clearly his flight plan. He made it very clear. And I figured we'd take a quick look at sort of the tail of the tape, as they say in boxing. In less than a year, Donald Trump has approved 626 airstrikes. I'm going to read real quick in my best Edward R. Murrow voice a timeline of these, just to give you a sense of what's been going on. February 1st last year, the U.S. military initiated strikes in Yemen. You'll remember this from Signalgate. This was the sort of first indication that we would have a foreign policy that was driven as basically improvisational amateurism. March 13th, U.S. military launched strikes against ISIS insurgents in Iraq. June 22nd, Trump strikes the Iranian nuclear facilities. We all remember that, Bordeaux and Natanz. September 2nd, U.S. military begins a campaign of at least 34 separate, actually 35. I wrote this before yesterday. There was another strike yesterday, 35 military strikes in the Pacific and Caribbean on suspected narco boats. December 19th, the United States initiates a bombing campaign against ISIS in Syria. December 25th, the president ordered attacks in Nigeria. And on December 30th, what brings us here today, the United States launched its first strike inside Venezuela, followed up on January 3rd of this year with the military attack that captured Nicolas Maduro and his wife. Followed up on January 10th by more strikes, over 35 targets in Syria. On the 27th of January, there were 57 strikes on ISIS targets in Somalia. And as I said just yesterday, we saw another attack in the Eastern Pacific. So it's quite a difference. It's quite a difference from the rhetoric of the three campaigns that he ran. So what happened and why do we have this? I read something last week, which I thought was really good, and I commend to everybody here, by Stephen Wall, a great strategist and writer. It was in Foreign Affairs, and he used the term a predatory hegemon. He said that Donald Trump is a perfect archetypical predatory hegemon, where the central aim is to use Washington's privileged position to extract concessions, tribute, and displays of deference from both allies and adversaries alike in the pursuit of short-term gains in what it sees as a purely zero-sum game. And that's an important part. That's his definition that I just read to you. That's really important, that whole notion of zero-sum. I'm originally from New York. I remember Trump in the 60s, 70s, 80s. I remember when that book came out, The Art of the Deal. And if you go back and you look at that, what you find is he says, I don't believe in win-wins. There is no such thing as a good deal that's a win-win. A good deal is I win, you lose. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not qualified to make psychological judgments about him. But I think that, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. This is a guy who does not believe in allies, partnerships, sociedades, as you would say in Spanish. He believes in a zero-sum world that is highly transactional. My own description of perhaps Trump's organizing conceptual vision is a lot more prosaic. Back in February of last year, I was interviewed by The Guardian, and they said, as The Guardian always does with, that marvelous educated Oxbridge accent, so Ambassador, what do you think will be the organizing concept for Donald Trump's second term? And it was February, right? And I said, I think if you want to understand him, you got to read Thucydides and you got to watch The Sopranos. And, it's held up so far. Thucydides, those of you who may not have been tortured by Jesuits like I was and had to read classics, he's the famous, Greek historian who comes up with the strong do what they will, the weak suffer what they must. That's his world. And Sopranos, that's pretty straightforward. That's where he is born. And we can come back to that. And the reason I say that is, and I do feel very, very strongly about this is the primordial ooze that he emerges from. He was not a mobster, but he was a real estate guy in New York when I was a kid. There were absolutely, it was the same cesspool. And this notion of turf, territory, that's mine. Gambino family, you got prostitution and drugs in Brooklyn. don't step into Queens. That's the way he's formed. And so what he's done is he's taken that and transformed it to statecraft, literally. So it's very clear, and I don't think there's much doubt, that he believes that might makes right. Stephen Miller said it exceptionally well in an interview shortly after the raid into Venezuela. I also believe, and others do as well, I'm not unique in this, that this is an extension of a mob mind that believes in spheres of influences. You delineate territory, you carve it up. If you accept that, his objective, invading Venezuela, is to demonstrate that in this hemisphere, in the Western Hemisphere, the United States is preeminent and we do what we want. His references to Greenland, to Cuba, to the Panama Canal, to Colombia, even. That guy better watch himself, Petro. Although now, where Rabelais Dictu, a couple of weeks later, they seem to be pals. I think that's two delusional minds talking, but that's a personal opinion, not a very professional one. But the bottom line here is it's power. It's all about power. I want it. I can do it. So I will do it. This is very similar to what makes Vladimir Putin tick. And I think anyone who studies that individual can see that this is exactly the motivation for going into the Ukraine. I want it. I have always believed that it's a fiction. The Ukrainian state, the nation state, they're actually part of Russia. It's ours. I want it. I can take it. So I'm going to do it. The similarity in style, the idea of a power play accompanied by crude, insulting language and unrestrained glee and delight in military combat, that also makes them very similar. I think a lot of this very antithetical for an American president, but sort of not that antithetical in other places in the world. But this in-your-face attitude is also something that is he was taught. He was literally taught this by Roy Cohn. And so for anyone who hasn't seen The Apprentice, Run, Don't Walk, it will give you at least like me, a non-psychological professional's insight into what makes the president tick. And at the end of the day, he is the one who's flying this thing. I think something we have to keep in mind about this is that while his presidency is highly personalistic, and I believe will continue to be, look at what in just 11, 12 months we have turned our backs on. In ordering the invasion into Caracas, Trump literally rejected and did an about face on the evolution of almost 100 years, I would argue, of American foreign policy that built international institutions. Now, to be honest, the first sort of 50 years of this, right, you have Wilson, he tries to start. The first 50 years, we're feeling our way. The United States, you go back to his favorite president, William McKinley, and you look at really McKinley and Roosevelt are fueled by a naval power theorist, Alfred Mahan, and that idea of expansion, of territorial expansion. But even back then, the United States was always a hesitant imperial power. We didn't really want to run things. Bad Bunny reminded us on Sunday that we still run a few little small things, and they make us very uncomfortable. I mean, just a small anecdote, but we never knew literally what to do with Puerto Rico. State Department couldn't touch it. The Department of the Interior, sort of did the land stuff about it, but they didn't want to touch the politics. And, we know our history in the Philippines, we know our history in Panama, and look at Panama. I mean, how ironic is it that the most, in my view, personal opinion, the most long-term visionary decision by Jimmy Carter in 1977, which, by the way, in a declassified memorandum by none other than Henry Kissinger, the great Henry Kissinger, realpolitik power player, wrote to the President Nixon, we got to get out of Panama. This thing's bad for business. The rest of the world is decolonizing. We don't need to be there. We got to get out. That it's Donald Trump and this present moment that we're living that sees us once again coveting the Panama Canal, and in the very inchoate and purposely vague, I believe, on many occasions, language of the president, we are running the canal now. We're not, we can talk about it in detail. I can bore you to death about it. We're not running it, nor were the Chinese. The Panamanians were running it. They were running it exceptionally well, and they were running it to the benefit of everybody on the East Coast, to perhaps the detriment of some of the Long Beach and West Coast port people, but who imported stuff directly from Asia and got it at the lowest possible cost. But go back to this idea that the United States, we built it. We built the international rules-based system. We accepted the role, if you will, early in the 20th century. It sputters along, but after the 1950s, after the Second World War, the organization, 1947, the organization of the national security system in the United States, we really have a moment that is, again, nonpartisan. It is shared between Republicans and Democrats of the moment, that it's better for us. The idea of the Bretton Woods system, the idea of the UN, the notion that we avoid war, the catastrophe of the Second World War and all the death, it's better for us. This is not Mother Teresa. This is enlightened self-interest. And over decades, we work on it. We don't make it perfect. It's never perfect. The affairs of man are always messy. But it had been since, I would argue, and I'm not arguing, it's a statement of fact, since that time, there was an institutional approach to foreign policy that was enormously beneficial for the United States and for most other nations. And this is really important here. The idea of the post-Second World War folks who were, I think it's Vandenberg, present at the creation, or maybe it was Foster Dulles or Chip Bolin. I forget who said it, but those guys, who was it?
Atchison.
Thank you. It was Dean Atchison. Present at the creation, they purposely did not build an empire. They purposely built something that was not an empire. They envisioned and created an enterprise, which is far more inclusive and farther reaching, I would say. And in that enterprise, and this is key, all nations, not just democracies, but all nations, whether they were democratic, authoritarian, or even outright dictatorial, they could play. And the only rule was they could play fully, they could play selectively, but you had to abide by the rules. And that becomes our basis for international law. That becomes our basis. Now, did the United States, did all the other countries follow it perfectly? No, of course not. But one of the things I have always said and used to say during my career as an ambassador about American foreign policy is that we had an unbelievably, not unique, but a very special and highly developed capacity for self-correction. And we would make the effort to self-correct. And we had people like, in my part of the world, President Clinton, who went to Guatemala, and the asymmetries of power, economic, military, population, you name it, between the United States and Guatemala are just off the charts. And there is the president of the United States recognizing the United States did not live up to its human rights values when it supported dictatorial governments in Venezuela, in Guatemala during the war. I was there. It was an amazingly powerful moment. It was the kind of moment that created soft power, right? You all know Joseph Nye. You all know what, soft power is. Follow a number of years, Hillary Clinton coins the term smart power. It was smart. It was soft, and it did work for a very, very long time. And I would argue that we are in the tipping point, in the inflection point, whatever you want to call it, where the United States is now consciously, willingly, and aggressively turning its back on that tradition. Okay, talk a little bit about Venezuela. The first thing I want to do when I talk about Venezuela is I want to dispel any sense, and it could be up for discussion, but I think the facts show that it's really not, that this is just a continuation of American invasions into Latin America. Anybody who's ever read one of my favorite names for a United States Marine of all time, Smedley Butler's book. Right, this was a storied American Marine who ran what were called the Banana Wars. He wasn't a commandant, but he was a senior battlefield leader. And it's from this small little historical anecdote. It's from the Banana Wars where the United States would send down Marine contingents into places like Nicaragua, into Haiti, into other places in Central America for short or long periods. And then obviously in the Panama Canal Zone, which was U.S. territory, that something the Marines still to this day teach and use called the Small Wars Manual. And that is what the American military, the folks who went into Afghanistan and Iraq, that is what they based COIN strategy on. Counterinsurgency strategy was based on that. Anyway, Butler has this long career, and at the end, he gets very bitter and he testifies before Congress and he writes a book and he kind of sadly dies in ignominy. But he basically recognizes that his famous line is, "War is a racket. And I was nothing more than muscle for the big boys on Wall Street." Mm-hmm. And so there were plenty of times where the United States, as they did in Guatemala, in El Salvador, in Panama, made the Americas safe for the United Fruit Company. So this is not to argue that everything was pristine in the past and now we've all thrown it away. But there was always, as a result, I would argue, of the American polity's desire for a pushback with ideals. And so unlike most European nations, unlike most nations around the world in recorded history, American foreign policy has always been a relatively unique sort of alchemy between hardcore interests and our best ideals. And those best ideals are the things that undergirded the international rules-based order: human rights, self-determination, respect for sovereignty of other nations, a clear desire for and processes and venues for conflict resolution before you go to breaking out the axes and the battle swords and just whacking each other into oblivion, where might makes right. And I think that's where we are now. Venezuela is very clearly that. The invasions into Panama and Grenada, very, very different. And I won't go into it here. I've got a little bit here, but we can go in later if anybody's interested in it. But here's the one sort of key takeaway I would say. Both of those efforts, both in Grenada and in Panama in 1989, and I would argue in Afghanistan and Iraq, leaving our hemisphere, they were efforts to block dictatorship and to support democracy. And I think that's fundamental. What was the desired end state? In Panama, it was a democratic government. In Grenada, it was a non-communist leader and a democracy. Again, lots of messy considerations, but you can't take them off the table. They were there. They were stated in the document. And most importantly, they were communicated very clearly right during, and these are both Republican presidents, but if you remember, Ronald Reagan announced that literally the day it was happening. And George H. Herbert Walker Bush, Bush 41, father, did the exact same thing in Panama. More importantly, they consulted with neighbors before they went in. We didn't exactly consult with the Brits too much. Margaret Thatcher was a little upset, but they did consult with regional neighbors in the neighborhood and at least made the case. This is why we're going to do what we're doing. You can't stop us. The asymmetry of raw hard power is just a fact, but we want you to understand why we're doing it. None of that is happening today. So if in the past you had a different desired end state and a different motivation for the exercise of raw American military power, what you have today in Venezuela is something very, very different. It is very clear from the president's own press conference in Mar-a-Lago the day after that democracy in Venezuela is simply not one of the objectives. I think it's fair to say that if it happens along the way, he as an individual, as president of the United States in charge of American foreign policy, not going to do anything to get in the way of it, but only once his core objectives have been achieved. And that's really important. His core objectives. These are not the core objectives necessarily of even the entire bureaucracy of his senior foreign policy team. And we can talk about that and the sort of competing factions in there. More likely, and I am the very first to say, Nicolas Maduro not being in Caracas, good thing. How it happened, bad thing. My personal view is this was a violation of our Constitution, Article 1 versus Article 2, and it was clearly a violation of international law. Now, international law is not enforceable unless you happen to be in the very strict confines of the ICC. And even there, you can opt out of the ICC. So it's not enforceable, but it's one of those things that's really, really useful to have. There are reasons why neither Republican nor Democrat administrations of the United States pushed the United States to join or resisted efforts to push the United States to join the ICC, but wanted to be a friend of it, provided most of the funding. There are really good reasons for that, because it is better to have processes to hold people accountable than just to have might making right, because all that leads to is bloody pendulum swings back and forth. So again, I think the fact that Maduro is out is a very good thing. I think the fact that there was not a wholesale transition by clearing out the entire, Chavista or Madurista leadership is not necessarily a good or a bad thing. It would have been an impossible thing if we were not willing to commit boots on the ground. And there, I do have to say, you have to look at the rhetoric, the campaign rhetoric that we started with. Donald Trump has been amazingly coherent and consistent. The notion that he will put American troops for an extended period of time on the ground in a warlike situation or an invasion scenario has always been anathema to him. And he lived up to it. So once again, you take a few creative liberties with the English language. Yeah, who's running the place? We're going to run the place. What does that mean? Well, what it means is, I know I'm going to make a reference here most people won't get, but the great old British rock band, The Who. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. That's what you have right now. All right. What are some of the consequences for the international system? I think the very first is that Trump's rejection of the rule-based order in favor of a clearly imperialistic, non-institutional, and power-based order that he believes strengthens U.S. national interest is, as I said, both wrong and mistaken. What I think the other the big consequence of the international system is that we are literally witnessing just how weak it was. Look at how quickly it is collapsing when you take the Jenga piece of American leadership out of it. I mean, look at what's happened in Europe. Look at the sputterings of, Macron makes these noises. Rutte at NATO makes the kind of tribute, obeisance, and dutiful praise of the most powerful authoritarian in the room, which is President Trump. He makes those kinds of noises. There's a tremendous, tremendous lack of organization, lack of resolve. And one of the things I think we can say about the international system is we built it and we were the core of it, we being the United States. And everybody else followed and marched to our tune. And without us, they're kind of tuneless right now. It is not too far to say that it is an orchestra in desperate need of a conductor. And right now, that conductor is AWOL. I think that the other thing we have to keep in mind, and we talked about the mob boss mentality, but the other thing we have to keep in mind is that this presidency is very personalistic. There are a number of competing factions, and in the Q&A period, I hope we get into that. I won't go into it here. I'm just going to I'll do a quick time hacker. Yeah, because I want to leave most of the time for conversation. But what I thought I would do here, looking specifically at Venezuela, was challenge my own thoughts. Okay. And I think everybody knows this isn't just something you should do in academia. You should do it in every aspect of your life. Challenge your own assumptions. So you clearly know where I stand on this administration's foreign policy. But I figured what I would do would be take something that is a little more Trump adjacent and sort of go through what they're saying and see what people think as a way to start conversation. And specifically on Venezuela. And it has to do with the Atlantic Council, which is another think tank in Washington. They're, like all the think tanks right now, looking for relevance. I mean, quite frankly, not all of these academic policy think tanks for decades could reach out, touch people in the administration, get policy positions put forward. I mean, it's enormously healthy. I can't tell you how much I benefited, and I'm sure you did too, Madam Secretary, from having an active conversation that frequently challenged positions, whether it was based on former practitioners like me or academics. There's not a lot of that going on right now. It really is difficult to get into the White House if you're not already in there, or if you haven't paid to get in there. But anyway, these guys wrote, and it's a number of people, and these are all my friends. They're all people I consider friends, and they're all Latin American experts. And what they did was they put together a memo to the president. It's a pretty tried and true format. If you could talk to the president, what would you say? Okay, so this is what they did. And they had in there some excellent high caliber people, one of whom is Jimmy Story, former U.S. ambassador to Venezuela. They had the head of the Latin American program at the Atlantic Council, Jason, and that. So let's look at what they say. So here's their bluff, right? Their bluff, military term, bottom line up front. Okay, here's their bluff. In the wake of Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro's January 3rd capture, the United States government can advance long-term goals by making the tough asks upfront. Time will decrease pressure on Delcy Rodriguez to make critical reforms. Clear benchmarks should be set for what Rodriguez must agree to do in the first 3, 6, 9, and 12 months. Washington should urgently address structural economic and security issues while laying the conditions for free and fair elections where the result will be respected. Okay, my very first thought upon reading that is, thank God I'm no longer a bureaucrat, because this is like the classic aspirational deep state language. It's the sort of stuff I wrote for decades, right? And I get it, and I hear him, but I guess you got to ask, okay, so how you doing? How's that working for you, right? It's all well intentioned. There's nothing wrong with that at all. I can't find anything wrong. But the first priority there, set clear benchmarks for what Delcy Rodriguez should do this year. In addition to economic reforms, the United States should push Delcy Rodriguez to stop torture and surveillance. Okay, how we doing? Not so good. Okay, we can agree they haven't stopped imprisoning people. They've been releasing a few people. They've been rearresting a few people. Dorothy, you and I were talking about Guanipa just on Sunday. They're just not doing so well. The releases are all what are called cautelares, which means you're not freed from prison. You are given house arrest. You must report every certain day. They have all kinds of cautelares. Basically, is like a conditional release, but these are not pardons. These are simply to give the U.S. administration the opportunity to say political prisoners are being freed. And I don't think it's very accurate to say that, although undeniably you are seeing the pictures of some people who are being reunited with family. That's a very good thing. And I do have to say that in all of my criticism of Venezuela policy, you can't do things overnight, right? There is an argument to be made that this has to be a transition. The issue is, can you do it in such a way that you're being honest and transparent in what you're looking for? And I think that's where this administration is falling down. My colleagues over at the Atlantic Council said, ensure that the Helicoide torture facility quickly closes. So if for folks who may not be aware, there's a horrible, horrible prison in the center of Caracas, or not really in the center, but you know where it is. And it has become very emblematic. It's like in the Lubyanka in the Soviet days. This is where all the dissidents go. This is where Sabine, the secret police, do have horrible, like Savak, former Iranian Savak style torture experts. This is where people are subjected to all kinds of psychological and physical torture. It should be shut down. We've seen pictures and images of this in Syria after Assad's departure, and it's on that scale. It's Gothic horror, and it shows the true nature of the Maduro regime, of which Delcy Rodriguez and her brother Jorge Rodriguez are part and parcel. And so you can't say, well, they're the good Chavistas. No, if you are in a government that systematically kills and tortures and intimidates people, my feeling is, personal view, is that you're in for a penny, you're in for a pound. And so the call for this to be closed is an excellent suggestion by this policy group. It's not happening. And I think it's fair to say it's not going to happen anytime soon. But Rubio said in his testimony just 2 weeks ago, this has to go slow. All right, fine. We'll have to see. So we do have to give them a little bit of time. The Guanipa case we can talk about when we open it up. The second big recommendation was for them to identify and remove non-diplomatic personnel, including military trainers from countries that pose risks to U.S. security interests, such as Russia, Iran, Cuba, and China. Okay, what does this mean? It means that they want some authority. So this would be the National Guard of Venezuela. This would be the military forces of Venezuela. This would be Sabine, the secret, or not so secret, the intelligence police. To what? Knock on embassy doors, the Chinese embassy in Caracas, the Iranian embassy in Caracas, and say, let me see your manifest of who's here. Okay, I want this guy, that gal, this guy. I want him out on the next flight. That's not happening. That's not going to happen. There will be pressure, there will be noise, but they're not going to close them down, not anytime soon. So I think none of this, here's another one that they had, and this is again, this is like where Washington, goes straight for the tree, not for the forest. Collect and warehouse all shoulder-fired and anti-aircraft missiles, anti-ship missiles, drones, and other offensive capabilities. Surveillance of warehouse weapons should be shared between the government in Caracas and the United States. I mean, that is like, paragraph 12, subsection C, in incision number 1, and that's not happening. Why? Because a guy named Diosdado Cabello controls the streets. Those shoulder-fired missiles, most of them, actually, according, and I haven't read classified information in a while, but we know they don't trust themselves with them. So they do have a whole bunch of shoulder-fired missiles. How come none were fired against invading military helicopters? It's a whole big theory that they were given the word to stand down. I personally don't buy that. I think the fact is that, very much like the tragic case of the American Marines in Beirut in 1983, their rules of engagement were do not have your magazines locked and loaded. And so the trucks came in and killed 243 American Marines in a horrible car bombing. In Caracas, in Venezuela, the reason that those shoulder-fired missiles are not deployed across the country is because Vladimiro Padrino, the head of the nominal titular head, Secretary of Defense or Minister of Defense of the Venezuelan armed forces, does not really control all of the subordinate commands. They are controlled by a whole host of armed actors, mostly out in western and southern Venezuela. So to have your armory deployed all across the country where you can't have centralized control over, most of them are sitting in warehouses. So this great suggestion by technocratic Washington folks, who I started my conversation saying I laud and I approve, it's a great tree. It's not the forest. And so that's where we come back to this idea of how do you hold the Trump administration responsible for what's going on the ground when you're not going to have an honest conversation? And I think it's very clear. Marco Rubio said in his testimony to questions like this, I can't tell you. I can't tell you how long. I can't take forever. He argued for an iterative process. And what he said was, at the end, we're going to go into three phases. And I remember the three phases of Afghanistan. It was clear, hold, and build. A guy named Phil Zelikow, and he wrote the strategy. And it's one of those things that we always say, it briefs well in the JCS tank over in Roslyn. But like Clausewitz once said, the famous, German historian of war or theoretician of war, no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy. And what we have here is to the extent the Trump administration had a political plan, very clear, they had a tactical military plan. They rehearsed it over and over and over. And if you want to talk about that, I can talk about that. Task Force 160, the aviation element that did that, the helicopter pilots, just amazing work. And when I say amazing work, it sounds kind of bloodthirsty and whatnot, but the reality is militaries are militaries, and no nation state is ever going to survive for very long without one if it intends to be a leader. The United States has always been, and because of the size of our economy, we're going to continue to be one. So be happy that you have a military that can do that. The downside of that is that it creates an expectation that every military operation is like that. And I can tell you, because I used to train Task Force 160 back in the early 80s on night vision goggle amphibian operations. They never used to fly on helicopters, and that's what we Marines did. And these guys came in and they were warrant officers with 2,000 and 3,000 hours. They are the best pilots in the world. And what they did was simply amazing, but they were lucky as hell. You remember in Abbottabad, they dropped a CH-47 because nobody counted on the swirling wind patterns underneath. And they had what's called settling with power, and they had to blow it in place. Again, successful mission. Take your hat off to the tactical military aspect of this. But you've got, again, von Clausewitz, right? War is just politics by another means. Where are the politics? Where's the policy behind it? And there, I find it unbelievably ironic that this paragon of military tactical training and execution is compared to what I see as a very pathetically amateurish and improvised policy for the follow through of a sovereign nation state that, for better or worse, is not going to go away and is going to continue to present the United States with multiple challenges. So what do you think? I think I'm going to end right there, and we can go to questions that folks have. And I'm happy to talk about, if people are interested in it, things beyond Venezuela. I was fortunate to spend pretty much all my career looking at Latin America. I served in a number of places. I visited most places. And it's what I do today from a civilian perspective, working with journalists all across the Americas. So happy to open up to anything like that. But thank you for listening so far. I always have this one thing I always do. I always find somebody who's sleeping when I'm talking, and I sort of make an example of them. None of you guys slept. I'm surprised, but thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. All right, we've got 35 minutes for questions. I think Dorothy wants to go first, but I'm going to abuse my privilege of chairing this to ask a question. Then we'll go to Dorothy. So,
You've got the power. Use the power.
Use the power. Act like a mobster. Think like a mobster. So, a couple of months ago, we had the Chilean ambassador to the United States.
Juan Gabriel.
That's right.
Great guy.
Sitting just where you're sitting. Now, Juan Gabriel Valdez is, he worked for Barrett. She's a man of the left. We asked him about Venezuela and the consequences, the downstream consequences of Venezuela for the larger Western Hemisphere. And he got really serious and said, it's really bad. He said, in Chile, we have things happening that never happened before in Chile. And it's happening because of the transnational criminal activity emanating outwards from Venezuela. Juan Gabriel said, we have murders of a kind we never thought we would see. We have children being murdered. We have people being decapitated in Chile. And it's because of criminal activity emanating from Venezuela. Could you comment both on the diagnosis and the implications for US policy? If, Venezuela really is the crucible of a kind of transnational criminal malaise that is roiling our hemisphere, didn't something need to happen?
What a great observation. And I'm so glad you brought up a dear friend of mine, Juan Gabriel Valdez. So here's what I would say in response to him. Undeniably, nobody denies that the Maduro regime had become, in the last, especially sort of 7 to 10 years, the first 10 years of Chavismo, it was not a paradise. But the people who were there at the start, and we were talking about this earlier, Teodoro Petkov, if you look at some of they were basically social democrats. Yeah. They were not ideological. Hugo Chavez was not an ideological communist. Hugo Chavez was a populist messianic leader who made natural common cause with the leftists of the hemisphere because he saw in Venezuela exactly the same conditions that existed in Cuba in 1959, existed in El Salvador in the late 70s, early 80s. He saw a tremendous disparity between the haves and the have-nots, right? A hierarchical pyramid of power, control, and money, where a few folks up top got it all, and everybody down below is scrambling for the crumbs. It sounds sadly like the way our country is moving, if you've seen those statistics about wealth distribution. Okay, so what's the natural historical response to that? It's some kind of better distribution by a munificent government that understands that its remit is not just its remit, but its obligation is to all the citizens, not just to the moneyed interests who sit at the top of the power pyramid. Okay, that all gets corrupted by the time Chavez is dead. Okay, 2013, 14, Maduro comes in. That is when they move into, the Maduro regime moves into high gear, being nothing more than a rent-seeking, human rights abusing, authoritarian system that subjugates its people via intimidation and torture. So no questions asked. They are a horrible, horrible government, and the people who paid the biggest price are the 7 to 8 million Venezuelans who've had to emigrate out. It's a terribly tragic term. They're called caminantes, the walkers. So when you have to leave home, and we know this from time immemorial, nobody wants to leave their home. Very few people are like me who want to go out and live outside your country for your whole life. People leave because they have to, because they're desperate. And you see the response from Madurismo, as they call it now, but the Venezuelan government is, let them go. Who cares? We're here because we're selling oil, because we're selling gold, because we're doing all kinds of things here. We're violating norms. I mean, the litany of international rules-based norms that I accuse the Trump administration of perpetrating pale in comparison to these guys. And so what do? But, to quote that great American philosopher, Ron Burgundy, this is really hard. You can't just decide, or you can just decide, and that's what we've had. But the question we should ask ourselves is it the right thing to do to just go in and knock off the top piece of that, the very top layer of the cake? So when Juan Gabriel says that Venezuela is this epicenter, this cauldron of transnational criminal organizations, I would argue he's right, but he's exaggerating. There has been exactly one reported extra territorial killing of a Venezuelan dissident by the name of Ronnie Ojeda, resident in Chile. He was one of the 8 million, 7 to 8 million caminantes, got to Chile, was starting a new life in Chile, and he was assassinated. No questions asked. Just like Roberto Sansón, Nicaraguan dissident living in Costa Rica, was assassinated. The Russian government does this. Bad governments do this. Totalitarian, dictatorial governments do this all the time. They go and they find the dissidents overseas and they kill them, or they harass them, or they mess with their money, or they do any number of things to show that we can reach you no matter where you are. They did this. The fact that they did this, not surprising. Does one case represent a trend? I would argue no. Do we have cases in the United States of Venezuela opening its insane asylums to lunatics and facilitating their movement to the United States? No, we don't. So the exaggeration by Juan Gabriel is understandable when you look at Chile. Chile is a really interesting long spaghetti strap of a country that has been one of the most exceptionally prosperous and successful countries in its own post-Pinochet era, that has had back and forth, and they've just swung back again to a more conservative side, electing a president who's a conservative, but they've got this whole rules-based ordered thing down better than the Americans do, better than the Europeans do. They are so transparent in their public procurement laws. They have written into, you want to think that the University of California system is woke. You want to see what is written into their office procedures in Chile. I know this personally because I've actually done some business down there. And literally all of us had to provide reams of documentation that we had no contact with anybody in the government, in the Boric government, to sell a technology down there. Laudable? Absolutely. A little bit overkill? Definitely. Juan Gabriel comes out of that world, and now what he sees is the Venezuelans who have immigrated there, along with others, along with Peruvians, along with Bolivians, who are in Chile because why? Because opportunity is very apparent even to people who don't have higher education. I can get a job there. I can feed my family there. I can maybe not be persecuted and die there. So yes, Venezuela absolutely had diplomatic connections with all of America's greatest hits of enemies. Was there a deep Iranian involvement in Venezuela? No. I can tell you in 2015, then Senator Menendez, currently a guest of the American state, was passed a bill that required the State Department to serve as the organizing entity for a whole of government study as to the Iranian presence in Venezuela. Now, this was a while ago, I admit, and I don't want to profess that, all was well, there was nothing here. But as of then, we found absolutely nothing, and the bill was never reauthorized because it was just a chimera. It was a joke. It was meant for political posturing. But what do the Iranians have there? So as I think was said by Marco Rubio in his testimony, if tomorrow I see an Iranian drone factory in Zulia state or in Caracas, well, then maybe we will use military action to take that out. You almost feel like saying, duh. I mean, there was never an Iranian drone factory in Caracas. It's not like that much change. So while I want to be careful to say, yes, it was a threat. Money laundering, big time. Gold smuggling, big time. Phantom oil or phantom fleet oil transfers, big time. But let me ask you, are those essential threats to the American people? Did my mom, 87 years old, reads 2 newspapers a day, up on the whole world? Did she feel threatened by the fact that there was illegal gold being mined and exported out of Venezuela? Did she feel threatened because Russian trawlers were being refitted to be tankers to take out, turn off their transponders? I would argue no. And if you look at the Trump administration's own DEA reports, somewhere between 8 and 10% of all the cocaine consumed in the United States. Now, first of all, cocaine is not a weapon of mass destruction. I'm sorry, but that's just a perversion of the English language. It's bad. I don't encourage it. We should fight it by all means. Let's do it under the rule of law. You and I both know what an STD 27 call is. We spent many times on it. Do it under the rule of law. One, it's a hell of a lot cheaper. Two, it's a lot more effective than just literally extrajudicially deciding that boat has drugs on it, so we're going to kill you. Please go in the US code. You were a prosecutor, ma'am. Go in the US code and find me the maximum sentence for drug trafficking. It's not capital punishment. And yet, this administration has unilaterally decided that's what we're going to make the punishment for suspected drug trafficking. Now, to be honest, those are all narco boats. There's no question about it. I mean, there may have been a fisherman or two on them, but they're narco boats. But that's the bottom layer. You want to go after the serious enterprise? We also know how to do that. That's a lot harder. It takes a lot more time, patience, and coordination. And I think that Juan Gabriel's comment is genuine. It does reflect a serious threat, but it also is exaggerated from a Chilean perspective, because when you live in Chile and everything tends to work, and all of a sudden you start to see encampments up on the hill outside of Chile, and who lives up there? Oh, the Venezuelans live up there. Oh, well, xenophobia is a fact of every society, and it's always easier to blame the enemy. So, wait, Dorothy.
Should we collect a few? Like, I'll give my question.
Sure.
Okay, so,
Means I have to write.
So you mentioned in your remarks, let's get into the factions in the Trump administration in the Q&A. So that's what my question is about. So I guess it seems like what happened was a major victory for the Marco Rubio Hawk faction, right? And a defeat for the Rick Grenell normalized relations with the Maduro regime faction. But then I was thinking on our walk this morning, actually what's going on now, where we're normalizing a relationship with a non-democratic, Chavista authoritarian regime, and handing out oil fields to cronies with no auction, et cetera, is exactly what the Hawks criticized Grenell for. That was the vision that Grenell had, basically, or that his critics would say he had. So which factions' ideas are prevailing?
Great question. Great question. Ma'am.
So, to your point about xenophobia, I'm curious what the perception is. I'm curious how the Trump administration's rejection of the rule of law domestically and the hideous stuff going on in Minnesota in particular, I'm assuming people outside the country are reading about it and seeing these photographs, and I'm curious how you see international perception of our internal turmoil and collapse of the rule of law domestically, and how that plays into the larger international politics and economics.
Cool. Why don't we take one more?
How many do you want to take?
Yeah, why don't we take three? Go in three. Three is always good.
Okay, I'll look at the back.
First of all, I just want to thank you for being here. I don't necessarily have like a super technical question, but I'm really I'm the second year of my undergraduate career or whatnot, and I'm really interested. My family is immigrants from Mexico, so I'm really interested in pursuing a career in international affairs, specifically to Latin America. And I was just wondering if you had any advice, specifically in today's political climate, about what I should be aware of, but I should expect, et cetera.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Okay, good. Let's go quick and we'll try to get another round in. Factions and Trumpism. Absolutely. So this is one of those things where don't believe everything you see and hear. So from the very beginning of this administration, we knew that the and I'm going to be very specific here, and it is not meant to cast aspersion on an entire community, but the Cuban American policy community, okay? Cuban American policy community that is centered mostly in Miami, in the first Trump administration, had a number of its favorite sons and daughters throughout the administration. And they, not surprisingly, had a fellow by the name of Mauricio Claver Caron, who was the president's national security advisor for Latin America, famously once say that the road to Havana leads through Caracas. And what that means very clearly is we want to have regime change in Cuba. Well, get in line. That's a long line. We'd all like to have regime change in Cuba. The question is, at what cost, and is it a threat to the United States? And if it's not, what do? We tried it a certain way back in 2015 with President Obama, and it got shut down when President Trump was elected. Okay, so we still have the same thing. There is that little bit of the, I forget, it was UNESCO, you're good on the quotes. Who's the one who said, if you keep doing the same thing over and over and expect a different result, that's a definition of insanity? Somebody said that. Some AI will dig it up. I know I wasn't smart enough to say it, but it's true. So we've been doing the same thing with Havana since roughly about 1962, 63, with one brief interregnum, and that got shut down. So they came to office back in 2016 or 17 with a view that that Venezuela was easier to tip, and if you remember back then, you had the commodity boom, which fed Venezuela for so long, and that had bottomed out, and there were real problems, economic problems. And that's when we saw the height of the caminantes, the people leaving. And so the belief was in the Trump administration, in the first Trump administration, was if we just do something to light the fire, pressure them, we're going to be able to, there'll be a popular uprising. They love this thought of like a Romanian Ceausescu style, Mussolini style, vicious sort of attack on all that is evil sitting in the presidential palace. Sadly, that doesn't happen a lot because most people don't show up in the streets, especially if there are rifles on one side and, garbage cans and Molotov cocktails on another, because the rifles usually win. And most people know that. So what they tried to do was ram through a humanitarian convoy of food, because literally there is to this day serious food insecurity in Venezuela. They did it through Colombia. I actually went to Cucuta. I had left the government. I was working for Univision, and I thought I'd go and catch a great story. And I knew a lot of people down there, and it was just simply a laughable, risible failure. Nothing happened. The Maduro regime was able to literally blockade the bridges going from Colombia into Venezuela, and it was a failure. And at that point, Donald Trump says, and it's well documented, the Venezuelan Democratic opposition are a bunch of losers. And there's nothing in Trump's world that's worse than, the loser, right? And that's what he thinks of them. That failure of a humanitarian convoy to spark a popular uprising in a beleaguered nation like Venezuela is what convinces him, I'm not throwing in with these guys. These guys are losers. Okay. Nothing really happens after that. A lot of infighting, a lot of Washington policy papers like the one I read to you back and forth. What happens? The people in Venezuela continue to suffer. They continue out migration. Biden, the fact is their efforts were heroic, but they were also kind of like a charge of the light brigade. Somebody I know very well, used to work for me, a fellow by the name of Juan Gonzalez, negotiates something called the Barbados Accord, which basically is a trade of a couple of high-profile prisoners who were bad actors, no doubt, that the United States has gotten their hand on, for the promise to allow for transparent elections in Venezuela. The Miami Cuban policy crowd, and there are about 7 or 8 of these folks, but the key ones are 3 congresspersons, Maria Elvira Salazar, Carlos Jimenez, and Mario Diaz-Balart, and Secretary Rubio, who at that time is still in the Senate. And then there's a whole host of others around them, like Mauricio, like a fellow by the name of Carlos Trujillo. And they absolutely vitiate the Biden administration. And, you're naive, you're fools, you don't negotiate with them. You hear this line we talked about earlier about if you talk to dictators, you somehow are validating them. And what that process called the Barbados Accord process led to was a primary in February 2024, where, and this is one of those things that happens in international affairs, right? The unintended consequence. Maria Corina Machado, who is today the heart and soul of the Democratic opposition in Venezuela, and an enormously brave woman, long Democrat, she emerges from the fringes and becomes sort of the coronated almost, and it literally almost was like a popular coronation of her candidate for the elections that are going to be held in July. The Maduro regime immediately disqualifies her based on foolish technicalities. The Cuban American crowd laughs at the Biden administration. You see, you fools, you got ripped off by these guys again. They were never going to play along. But it does create a fact on the ground, and that is that Maria Corina Machado is today still the undisputed heart and soul of the Democratic opposition. They had to do a little bit of their own electoral chicanery. They took an old diplomat, a guy by the name of Eduardo Gonzalez Urrutia. They put him on top. He's the nominally elected president. The actas, it was all American advisors with Maria Corina and Eduardo Gonzalez, who Mark Fierstein among them, who gave them the strategy to take pictures of the actual tally sheets at all of the tables, voting tables around the nation. Those documents that are signed by table observers to include Chavistas are all actually now being held in the Panamanian National Bank. And you got this moment where everybody thought it's going to happen. The people of Venezuela are going to rise up. They didn't. Repression works. That's the sad truth of it. Repression works. So in comes Trump for his second term now. And Marco Rubio has not changed his tune. He comes out of a primordial ooze and he's never going to change his stripes. He will always, always have that same line that what are we looking for? Libertad, as the Cubans say, right? We want Democrats and we want to get rid of these bad communist dictators. There's nothing communist about any of these people, but that's the line that they use. And the rallying cry is effective. Rick Grinnell comes in. He doesn't know Venezuela from, South Africa. He's a Europeanist. He was a former ambassador to Germany. He's a log cabin Republican, which is an interesting trait in the family values second Trump administration. He is very smooth, though, and he's a wheeler dealer. That's all. And he has got this line that I can talk to these people, and he does. He gets a number of American kidnappees released, and he talks to all of these, not the majors, right? Oil guys, but these second tier kind of wildcatter people. The oil industry is fascinating when you look at how many players there are who can become relatively wealthy without being Exxon, Chevron, Shell, Gulf, etc. And Grinnell, so there is, as you say, in the first part of the administration up through the summer, this kind of dynamic tension between the Democrat idealists represented by Marco Rubio and the get along, go along pragmatists represented by Rick Grinnell. Okay, everybody believes when the bombing campaign of the narco boats starts that Grinnell has been fired. And he is told very publicly, stand down, no more contact with Delsey. He's the guy who's been talking to Delsey. He's brought in people like Harry Sargent. He brings in the Trafigura people. This is the guy who is the handler, so to speak, the intermediary to the Venezuelan Chavista, Madurista regime. And everybody believes that he's lost. Well, turns out he hasn't. And so what we see here is not what it appears to be. The president has made very clear from what we discussed in the beginning that he doesn't care about democracy in Venezuela at all. He literally dismissed Maria Corina Machado in his press conference saying, yeah, nice lady, pretty misogynistic right there. Okay, backhanded slap. Nice lady, not a lot of respect in her country. Shouldn't have the support. That's just patently afactual, non-factual. You can't. It's just not true. And yet that's how he dismissed her. And Marco Rubio continues to push, continues to like be in there and say, oh, but Maria Corina Machado, Maria Corina Machado. And then we had the whole Nobel Prize award, which was, I'm not going to go into it, but it was just degrading to see how Maria Corina Machado was literally, and that made to render tribute. Here, this is the most valuable thing I have. I've spent the last 25 years of my life being persecuted, being beat up in my Congress. I don't leave my country. I'm staying there. I could live a comfortable exile in Madrid like all of my opposition colleagues, but I don't. I stay there. We win the election. We prove to the world that we are the legitimate government. And you clip my Nobel Prize. And he clipped it. And it's sitting somewhere along with the rest of the gold in the White House right now. That has created a schism, not just inside Trumpism right now, but inside the opposition people. And it's a very, it's tragic, quite frankly, I think, because she is accepting the Marco Rubio line, which is hang on, we got to do stabilization. What is it? What's the three phases? Stabilize. Yeah, it's clear, hold, build. Exactly. It's the same idea that comes out of the Bush administration, but it's stabilize blank transition. I forget what the middle one's called, but it's build recovery. Maybe it is. Yeah, something like that. And we know what that is. We heard the president say oil, oil, oil. And there are going to be, oil is a dirty business to start with. Watch what's going to happen. It's going to be dirty on steroids. Okay, let me come over to xenophobia. I think very simply, the United States has lost to the extent it ever genuinely possessed it. And I am one of those people who believe that it did. We were not perfect. We talked about that, but we had a self-correcting tendency that the rest of the world could look to as an example, even if we didn't always live up to it. I think that it's fair to say that in probably the rest of my life, we won't recover that. There's no status quo ante. The world keeps turning, and I think that the United States will continue to exist as a very powerful nation in a multipolar world. I don't have any idea as to how long it will go. The thing that quite frankly hurts, not an emoting session, but what what I don't think we fully have processed in this moment, and that maybe in years to come there'll be movies, literature, Netflix series about it, is the disappointment that people around the world feel now, because they are born into much worse circumstances. We all know, you all know here at Berkeley, we're all 1%ers in terms of the world, right? We're all probably 10%ers in terms of the United States, in terms of your socioeconomic well-being, your Maslow's hierarchy of needs, whatever scale you want to put around it. Most of the people, and many of you come from places that are not the United States, you know this, most people live such low-level existences. And for at least 80 years, to, quote Ronald Reagan and before him, the Bible, the shining city on the hill, even if it wasn't true all the time, it was a comforting fiction, let's say. And many times that fiction did become reality. We were the single largest donor for humanitarian assistance for well over 70 years. Blew away the rest of the world. Yes, I know the Danes and the Nordics do more as a percentage of population, but there's like 12 of them and there's 335 million of us. We were the largest recipient of refugees for as long as the Refugee Convention existed. We're now just accepting South Africans. So I think what we don't appreciate, and to your question, ma'am, what is international perception? I think there's a tremendous amount of confusion, and that's generated straight out of the White House. But I think beyond everything, when you sort of settle the dust, there's a lot of anti-Americanism. There's going to be a lot of protests at embassies, and that's kind of it's prosaic and par for the course. But I think there's genuine disappointment. I think I think there always was, certainly in Latin America, there was always a feeling that we used to say about, or it's famously said about Antonio Somoza, the dictator in Nicaragua. Nixon said it. Yeah, he's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. I think there was a feeling throughout most of Latin America that, yeah, they're those gringos, they're sons of bitches, but there are sons of bitches. And there were ways in which they could come to accommodations. I think all that's been turned on its head, and I don't know. I don't see any short-term or medium-term recovery of it. I'm sure we'll emerge to something new. Final question about Mexico. Truthfully, my favorite, people ask me, what was your favorite place to serve? Mexico. And the reason is because it was just endlessly fascinating. And anytime I ever had any young officer come and say to me, yeah, I think I got this place figured out, I would be like, here's your plane ticket home. Mexicans don't even have this place figured out. I certainly don't have it figured out. Alan Riding wrote the book back in the 90s, Distant Neighbors. We remain that, and yet we remain so interconnected. What I would say to you, and we can talk afterwards, personally, but if you want to go into American diplomacy right now, understand that there's no text for what you're going to do. There's no primer. There's no academy. There's no institutional sort of basis from which you can learn. If you go into governmental diplomacy, that's very concrete, and there are other types of diplomacy. But if you go into governmental diplomacy right now, the good news is you'll be so low in the totem pole, frankly, that you're not going to be directly affected unless you're doing visa work. And then you will be, in terms of, who can you admit as refugees? Who can you recommend to the Department of Homeland Security for consideration, as a special case for a waiver under immigration law, things like that. But you're not going to be at an entry level involved in policy decisions, but you will be involved to the extent that you represent a flag. We were joking earlier about your bazillion flags in DHS, and what blue on green wars you had to settle. And I had them in Mexico. This is when the Department of Homeland Security was first put together, and ICE wouldn't talk to CBP, and CBP wouldn't talk to these guys, and they all sort of were doing what human beings do, which is protecting their feudal territory. And they all had challenge coins, and they all had flags, and they all wore different uniforms. Well, an embassy is nothing more than that. In Mexico, when I was the charge and the number two in Mexico, we had 37 different American agencies there. And I used to grab, especially the cops, the guys who'd started their life as cops. I would bring them in and I would say, let me see your flag. Let me see your challenge coin. And they'd all proudly put them up there. And I'm an old Marine, so I could play that game. And then I'd go out to the window and I'd go, look out there. What do you see? One flag. One flag. That's what we all serve. And I think that the challenge any young diplomat has today is, what does that flag mean and what am I serving? And you, ma'am, you referenced the just wholesale illegality and the violation of rule of law that we're seeing at home. Is that what that flag represents? And I don't have an answer for it. But I would recommend that if you're interested in that kind of work, there are other kinds of diplomacy. There is commercial diplomacy. There is the NGO community. There's academia. And you can be an ambassador without ever having been confirmed by the Senate. And you can represent the values that you bring to that one flag outside.
That seems like a perfect note on which to. So thank you so much.
Not at all. Thank you. Thank you.